to introduce Justin Wheaton, and he was John Monson's teaching assistant, and John Monson, like Dr. Curtin just mentioned, I worked very closely with his father, Jim Monson, for some 22 years, and John has always been there too. And John and I used to run the hills of Jerusalem together when I was a young man. But and John was 10 years younger than me. But anyway, the reason I mentioned that is Dustin was John's teaching assistant, and so John put us together. And I'm delighted to have Justin here with us. He got his first degree from King's University, and with a specialization in Messianic Studies. And so then he went on to get a Master of Theology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Wrote a very, I was impressed, a very impressive thesis on ancient Near Eastern polemics. What do peoples think of the gods of other peoples? Something like that. Mm-hmm. And so that thesis should stand him in good stead for the lecture tonight. I would guess that he has researched idolatry in Ugaritic and Akkadian and Aramaic, and probably even a little bit of Moabite. And so these are all the texts that you work with in the ancient Near Eastern studies. Now, Justin is here with us, but studying at The Ohio State in the ancient Near Eastern department in his PhD work. He is also finishing a Master of Divinity at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and I'm hoping that means that he has a pastor's heart and is looking at some ministry amongst us. So he has published a number of articles in Chosen People Ministries, and a couple other journals that he's had articles in as well. So he's for a young man, very impressive. So I welcome Justin to and his wife, Marion.
Thank you so much for that introduction. What's funny is about the master's thesis I wrote, Dr. Averbeck was my first reader, and Dr. Monson was my second reader. So, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Chag Sameach. It is such an honor to be here with you all and get to present on a topic that has very serious and everlasting implications. And this topic is one of the most important themes in the entire Bible, and it's equally significant for us today. So the title of my presentation is Who Do You Worship? The world of the Bible is filled with the allure, the temptation toward worshiping other gods or things, which very often led the people astray, led them away from the true God. So likewise, we face many of the same temptations toward idolatry today. So we have to take a step back and constantly ask ourselves, who is it that we really worship? And on a side note, I really wanted to do this topic because I love idols. Wait, let me rephrase that. I love the topic of idolatry. And I think this topic is very pertinent to Sukkot, which commemorates the 40-year wilderness wanderings when the Israelites, after they had left Egypt and right before they went into Canaan. And I think it's pertinent because during this time, they were continually tempted towards idolatry, and there was a constant struggle in the minds of the people to choose who their God was. Was it the gods of the neighboring peoples, or was it the true God? Now, when making this PowerPoint, I wanted this title page picture to have an ancient Near Eastern deity on it, but also I want it to be the ancient Near Eastern deity versus the true God. But then I started thinking, what pictures could I use for a God who has no images? Should I use a picture of nature, like the mountains or maybe the ocean? No, because then it looks like we worship nature. Should I use a picture of the Bible, maybe? Well, no, because then it looks like we worship the Bible. Should I show a picture of Jesus? That would have been a good one, but we don't really know what Jesus looked like, and I didn't want to put a random dude up there. Should it just be blackness? No, because then it looks like we worship nothing. So in the end, I decided to just use a picture of a Lamassu here. This was a Mesopotamian protective deity that with the head of a human, the body and ears of a bull, the wings of a bird, and it was placed by the throne of these Mesopotamian kings to protect them from evil. You can see these all over the world in various museums. This one in particular, I took at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute Museum. It was actually originally placed at the palace of Sargon II, king of Assyria. He was one of the Assyrian kings who destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And this was one of the deities, or at least a protective spirit, that the Assyrians relied upon for protection. And look what happened to them. Their empire was completely wiped out around 2,600 years ago, give or take. So with that introduction, here is what I want to do tonight in this short time that we have. I want to cover 5 things. First, I'm going to explain what an idol is, how to make one, and then what to do with it. And then I want to walk us through some of the gods that would have been encountered by the Old Testament people and the New Testament people. And then after that, I'm going to give a few case studies on how these gods were dealt with. And then I'm going to look at the gods that we worship today. And finally, I'm going to end the night with a description of the one true God who created the universe, the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and who personally came to earth as a man and died for our sins and provided a way for us to live with him in eternity. So the world of the ancient Near East, the world of the Bible, primarily takes place in this huge plot of land. We call it the ancient Near East. It's made up of places like Canaan, which later became Israel, and then Palestine, and then back to Israel. It's made up of places like Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Phoenicia, Philistia, Persia, Anatolia, and others. Greece and Rome, which we encounter in the New Testament period, or more broadly, the Second Temple period, they're not part of the ancient Near East technically, but they do heavily interact with it. Now look at this map for a second. I want to show you something very important about this tiny little piece of land right here that came to be known as Israel, what many have called the most valuable piece of land in human history. This tiny little area, surrounded by massive empires hundreds of times bigger, this seemingly insignificant territory that was walked by Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus, and millions of others. This place that Jim Monson calls God's testing ground of faith. Throughout the entirety of the history of the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, virtually every people group in this region of the world was vying for a piece of this land. Look at where Canaan is and how it's situated. This piece of land, this place, was a bridge between Africa and Asia and Europe. And they were able to contact each other and travel to each place. There was a large international trade center that was in this land, thanks in large part to the Phoenicians, who were expert sailors and could navigate this Mediterranean Sea. But because of reasons like these, it is at the crossroads of all of these giant empires, and throughout time, they all fought for control of this little piece of valuable property. Egypt, the Hittites, the Philistines, smaller groups like the Hivites, Girgashites, etc., Jebusites, Amorites, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, who comes from over here, the Greeks, the Romans over here, even the Arabs that come from over this way, and so on, all wanted control of this very valuable and strategically placed piece of land. All of this led to Israel, this land between, to quote Jim Monson again, becoming a cultural bridge. This tiny location where north, south, east, and west meet. It's all these interactions that led to Israel's contact with the various gods that we read about in the Bible. Now, before I go through some of the examples of these gods, let me explain what an idol is and how they were made in the ancient world. And I'm going to hop around with various people groups because we don't have time to survey all of them. This picture here is the head of an Edomite goddess, possibly, found at an Edomite shrine in, surprisingly, southern Israel. And I took this picture at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. In the ancient Near East, especially Mesopotamia, an important element of people's relationships with their deities was having a visual element. A statue of the various gods was considered a visible manifestation of the deities, and they would often make it out of wood or metal or stone. And then they would adorn them with precious stones, with jewels. This means that a craftsman would have to go out and cut down a tree in the forest, melt metals or hew stone, and then he fashioned it into a specific image and adorned it with silver, gold, jewels to make it presentable. In many places, the idols were even bolted down so that they couldn't move or be moved. So people couldn't steal them, but also so they wouldn't fall over. In Mesopotamia, when an idol or a false god was created, and before it was placed in the temple, it had to go through a ritual that lasted 2 days, in which this statue was given life, was separated from its earthly origin, and then fully integrated into the pantheon of the gods. This ritual is known as the Mispi Pitpi ritual, the washing and opening of the mouth. And this allowed the new god to take his place among the other gods. This statue was then purified with several times with water, incense, and fire. The opening of the mouth was performed with aromatic substances like honey, cedar, cypress, etc., and was meant to open the senses of the new god. This ritual also had an opening of the eyes component, but there's not a whole lot of information on how that worked. And then at the end of this lengthy ritual, the statue could receive food offerings, smell incense, hear prayers, and could see. It was then placed in the temple and considered a god. This is what differentiates an idol from just a wood carving or a statue. For it to be an idol, you have to get the essence of the god inside of it through a ritual. Now, every place in the ancient Near East, whether it's in Syria or Israel or Egypt or wherever, had things a little differently, but overall, they all look similar to this. So, we just went over what an idol is and how they were made. But how were they worshipped? The Bible constantly talks about the people worshiping idols to false gods. For a couple examples, Numbers 25 tells us that when Israel lived at Shittim, the place that they were right before they went in to conquer Jericho, they intermarried with the Moabite people, and they started bowing down and worshiping Moabite gods, specifically Baal Peor. In Exodus 32, the Israelites worship a golden calf, meaning like a young bull or a young ox, which was common in ancient Near Eastern thought. It was a common animal that represented power. So it was a logical choice for them to choose as an idol. The text tells us that they sacrificed to it and worshiped it. But what does all of this mean? What did worshiping entail? In the ancient Near East, worshiping an idol involved various actions on the part of the worshiper. One very important thing to keep in mind is that the idols, the gods, were completely dependent on their followers in virtually every way. And in Egypt, the temple was the house of its god in a very literal sense. The daily rituals were very important for worshiping the gods, and they were modeled on ordinary, everyday life. Every morning, the gods would be awakened with a hymn of awakening. The shrines were then opened. Their idols were ritually purified, meaning bathed. They were dressed, and then they were given breakfast in the form of offerings. At midday and later on into the day, lesser services of offering were celebrated. The god might give oracles. The god might receive visitors from other gods, or maybe he himself would go out and visit other gods in a procession. Processions were incredibly important for these gods because they're only pieces of wood and metal. They can't walk or move themselves. So their followers had to carry them. And then at the end of the day, they were shut in their temple until the next morning when the process started all over again. The life of the Egyptian god had its necessities and duties just like a king or a householder. And in this system, the priests controlled everything, and no ordinary person could witness or share in these rituals for most of the time. The common people, because of this, created smaller shrines or chapels at the gates of these temples or even at the cities. They could only contact the great gods, the big ones in the temples, during festivals when the gods came forth on procession. Interestingly, though, according to the late great Christian Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, he says that both the ordinary rituals and festival rites of Egypt were far more complex than anything in the Torah. Like the Egyptians, the Hittites of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, had similar views and practices for their idols. The Israelites didn't directly interact with this group because they were destroyed very early on in Israel's history by the Philistines and some other peoples. But the Hittites still had a great influence, especially with law codes. For them, the temple was the home of the god, and the priests were his staff, or her staff. Every day, the staff of the temple and the priests had to attend to the god's bodily needs according to fixed routines. She had to be washed, clothed, provided with food and drink, and entertained with dancing and music. And I say she here because the most important god for the Hittites was the sun goddess. The Hittites believed that the god was to be worshipped exactly the way a master was worshipped by or attended to by his servants. He was to his followers like a master was to his slaves. The gods had to be fed, tended, appeased, and even flattered. Then jumping forward many centuries to the Greco-Roman period, the time of the New Testament, there are many of the same elements that we saw with the more ancient peoples. The idols were the embodiment of the deity. Roman temples were the homes of the gods, and the activities between the gods and their followers reflected the same kind of activities that took place in human households and in human social settings. The idols were found and seen in their temples. They were fed, they were clothed, they were bathed, they were cleaned, and they received visitors. And during these visitations, the gods may be given the time of day, they may be anointed, they may have been amused by their worshipers. Women, for female goddesses, sometimes even pretended to do the hair of the female goddesses and held mirrors so the goddess could see herself. And because the idols couldn't move, many of them were also carried on in processions. Now, you may have noticed a very similar pattern of behaviors towards wooden, metal, and stone idols. They were wholly dependent on their worshipers for everything: food, drink, cleaning, bathing, traveling, etc. And this neediness of the gods gave humans some control over them. And one thing that remains consistent across the entire ancient Near East is that humans did whatever they could to try to reach into the divine realm and control the gods. This is why the God of the Bible forbade the making of images of him, because he doesn't need anything, and he doesn't even want his followers he doesn't want to even let them think they can control him. Now let's briefly talk about some of the gods of the ancient Near East. And this is important, I think, because these were the gods that the Israelites would have and did interact with. They were surrounded by these gods, and they were constantly tempted by them. And these are all mentioned in the Bible, either directly or indirectly. First, let's go over the gods of Egypt. This could be considered the first major group of gods that the people of Israel encountered, starting with Joseph and then into the Exodus. Now, Abraham does come from Mesopotamia, so technically his gods would have come first in Mesopotamia, but I'll mention them a little bit later. Now, what I'm about to show you is only a handful of the gods from ancient Egypt. And it's important to note that throughout the many different dynasties and periods of Egypt, the gods went through many changes or developments. So how a god was seen in the Old Kingdom, Egypt's very early period, can be very different from how it was seen in the New Kingdom. The first god I want to talk about is Re, pronounced Re or Ra. He's the sun god, and you can see him at the bottom right. He was depicted with a human body and a falcon head and crowned with a solar disk, and he was closely connected with kingship. Horus, at the top left, was a solar and sky god and the son of Isis and Osiris. He was depicted with a falcon head, or even fully as a falcon, and was believed to have protected the earth with his wings. The king of Egypt was seen as Horus incarnate. Ptah, who we can see right here. Ptah was one of the creator gods. He was wrapped like a mummy and had a shaved head and wore a tight-fitting cap. He created the world by speaking it into existence. Isis was the mother of Horus, the goddess of the earth, protector of the dead, and patroness of loving wives and mothers. You can see her in the top right. She was depicted as a woman wearing a dress with a headdress that had the solar disk and cow's horns. And she was often sought after for aid in dream interpretation. She comes into play in the Joseph story. Set, or Seth, who you can see right here, he was more of a complex god who went through many iterations over time. Overall, though, he can be thought of as the god of storms and darkness. He was the brother of Osiris and the uncle of Horus. And he was depicted as what Egyptologists call the Set animal, because he doesn't really look like any known animal. Sometimes he was seen as evil, other times he was seen as benevolent. Osiris, at the bottom left, he was depicted with green skin and had a pharaoh's beard. And he was the god of the netherworld, the place of the dead. And he was also identified with certain characteristics of the Nile River. He was the husband of Isis and father of Horus. And then finally, the king. And I put him in the middle for a reason. Later known as the Pharaoh in the period of the Bible. You can see him right here in the middle. The king of Egypt was thought to be deified, meaning that he was considered as a god. He was seen as the incarnation as the god Horus. The pharaoh that I have here is Ramesses II, one of the longest lasting pharaohs, reigned 66 years, outlived all of his sons but one, and he might have been the pharaoh of the Exodus, depending on dating. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the Canaanite gods. Just like with Egypt, I'm only going to discuss a few of them, but these are the most well-known gods from the Bible because they were worshipped in the land of Canaan for the many centuries that the Israelites were there. And I'm not going to be able to show pictures of all the gods because often images don't survive, and other times it's very difficult to pinpoint which god, or if this is a god, that this thing is depicting. El, who we can see right here, he was the father of the gods, the father of the Canaanite pantheon, and he's often depicted as an old man seated in a throne. Baal, right here, or Baal, is probably the most famous god in all of the ancient Near East. And you can see him, one of his stela right there. Baal is a general title meaning Lord. His personal name was Hadad, similar to how we call our God, we call God, but he has a personal name that he gave to Moses. He was the storm god and also a fertility god. He was the grandson of El and his wife Asherah, and the son of Dagon. And he's known for his famous battles with the sea god Yamu, in which he won, and also his big battle with the god of death, Mot, in which he was defeated and killed. Dagon, who's at the bottom left here, he was a grain deity. He's the father of Baal, and he was the main god of the Philistines. Asherah was the wife of El and the mother of many of the gods. She was a fertility goddess and the grandmother of Baal. And you might recognize the phrase Asherah poles that's found throughout the Old Testament. She's at the top left here. Astarte, who you can see right here, she was a goddess of love and war. In Mesopotamia, she's known as Ishtar, and then she comes into the Roman period as Venus, or in Greek, Aphrodite. She's right there. Shapshu, or Shemesh, was the sun goddess, one of the most powerful gods, and often might be the god of the city of Beit Shemesh at certain points. Often the sun gods are seen as all-knowing and all-powerful, because if you look up in the sky, the sun sees everything. It lights up the whole of the land. Yarihu, we can see right here, possibly a depiction of him. He was the moon god and another very powerful god, one of the top in the pantheon. He was likely the patron deity of the city of Jericho. Yarihu is the god, Jericho is the city. Molech, or Milcom, was the main god of the Ammonites. He's one of the gods who had child sacrifice as one of his worship methods. And then finally, Chemosh. He was the main god of the Moabites. He was a chthonic deity, meaning that he was associated with the earth or the netherworld. Now let me go to the Mesopotamian gods. This is who the people of Israel would have interacted with towards the exilic periods, when Assyria was coming over, and then Babylon was coming over, and everyone just got deported over there. Abraham would have known about most or all of these gods, except maybe one or two, because he came from southern Mesopotamia. And I'm only showing one picture here on this one. Often, real depictions of the gods from their time periods, not just modern drawings, are very difficult to find. Surprisingly, the further back you go in time, the less things survive. Marduk, also called Baal, began as the city god of Babylon and then later rose in prominence to become the king of the gods when he defeated the fearsome god Tiamat. Tammuz, or Dumuzi in Sumerian, was the husband of the goddess Ishtar, Astarte in the Canaanite pantheon. His associations developed throughout the centuries. He began as a divine shepherd associated with sheep, then later became the embodiment of spring vegetation, and then possibly developed into a grain deity. And you read about his practices in the book of Ezekiel, which I'll mention here in a minute. Shamash, also known as Shemesh or Shapshu in the Canaanite area, was the sun god and the Lord of justice. In the picture here, you can see the famed king Hammurabi receiving his law code from the god Shamash, who's seated. You might have heard of Hammurabi's law. This is the big basalt replica of it at University of Chicago. Sin is the moon god, known over in the West Semitic area, the Canaanite area, as Yarichu. And quick side note, the name of this god is pronounced Sin, not Sin. And I've heard sermons preached on the name of this god, relating it to the English word sin, and then making some sort of comparison with the worship of this god being a sin. Now, while it's obvious that worshiping this god, a god other than the true God, is a sin, the words seen and sin are completely unrelated. English wasn't even a concept in the minds of anyone who lived on earth at that time. In Hebrew, sin is chatat. So chatat and sin sound very different. Ishtar, in Sumerian, she's called Inanna. She's the Canaanite goddess Astarte. She was the wife of Tammuz. She was a war and sexuality goddess. And she's probably most known for her depictions as an eight-pointed star, which later became the cuneiform pictogram for the word God, called a dinger. Asher was the main god of the Assyrians, probably named after the city of Asher. Enlil, finally, was the king of the gods and lord of the air. Eventually, though, Marduk would rise up and come out on top and would subsume his role as king of the gods. And then the last one I want to talk about is just a couple of the New Testament gods during this time. And then I'll briefly say one thing about an early false view of Jesus that I think the apostles were encountering and arguing against in the Bible. And I'm betting that most of us are probably at least a little bit familiar with these Roman gods, or at least their Greek counterparts, because of the impact they've had on Western culture. Jupiter, known by the Greeks as Zeus, was part of two triads of gods. The first was Jupiter. Now, triad is different than Trinity. The first was Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinius. The second was Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. He was probably a war and fertility god and maybe a god of the air. Interestingly, in the book of Acts, when Paul and Barnabas go to the city of Lystra, the people thought that Barnabas was Jupiter in human form because of a miracle that Paul did. Mars, known in Greek as Ares, was the god of war and agriculture, as well as prophecy. He was the son of Jupiter and part of that triad that I mentioned with Mars, Jupiter, and Quirinius. Venus, right here, known as Aphrodite in Greek or in Canaan as Astarte. I did a lot of searching trying to find a good picture for this goddess because she's always depicted as naked, and I didn't think that was appropriate to put one of those pictures up here on the screen for everyone. So, she was the goddess of love and beauty, Mesopotamian Ishtar. Mercury, right here, Hermes in Greek, was the messenger god who protected travelers and protected the roads. In Acts 14, the passage I just mentioned, when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, the people thought that Paul was Mercury because he made a lame man walk. And then finally, just real quick, I want to mention an early heresy called Docetism. And I want to mention this because I think John is reacting against this group in at least the book of 1 John. And this was a group who believed that Jesus was divine, but he only seemed or appeared to be human, like a mirage. It was just an illusion. Docetists claimed that they denied Jesus' human nature. And I'll come back to this at the end. But quick side note, my wife Kaylin, as you heard, is going to be teaching a couple sessions on the early church in November, and she's going to discuss these guys and other Gnostics and heresies in more detail. So we've looked at what idols were, how they were made, and how the people worshiped them. Then we surveyed the various gods that the Israelites and later Jews and Gentiles would have interacted with and were tempted by. Now I want to look at some examples of what the Lord thought about these so-called gods and how he dealt with them, demonstrating at the same time to the people who were present and to us as the readers that he is the true God. And I'm going to give 5 examples, 4 from the Old Testament, 1 from the New Testament. The first example I want to talk about is probably the second most famous event in the entire Bible, and it forms the foundation for everything that follows, the plagues, which then leads to the Exodus. This event is going to be a world-shattering clash of the gods, with the God of Israel intentionally dismantling the entire pantheon, specifically targeting the deified Pharaoh, and dismantling the power structures of Egypt. The Lord is going to demonstrate through these 10 plagues that the gods of Egypt, who the people depended on for every aspect of life, are nothing at all. They're not even real. And he's also going to prove that the Pharaoh, who was also considered a god, was not powerful enough to protect himself, his people, or even his own son, who was also considered a god. He's going to show the Egyptians and the Israelites that, to quote Exodus 9, there are none like me in all the earth. So let me take us through the plagues found in Exodus 7 through 12. So to give a very quick background, Moses was born as a Hebrew slave during the time when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. He escaped slavery as a baby thanks to his mother and then was adopted by the daughter of the Pharaoh. Many years later, he fled to the land of Midian, where he encountered the God of Abraham. God told him that he was going to use Moses to free the Hebrew slaves and then bring them out of Egypt with his strong arm, with God's strong arm. Moses begrudgingly agrees, and he goes to Egypt and demands that Pharaoh release the slaves. Pharaoh refuses, and the plagues start. And then every time the Pharaoh refused to submit to the true God, the plagues got worse. The first plague was turning the Nile River to blood. This river was the lifeblood, no pun intended, of Egypt, responsible for keeping everyone alive with its annual flooding, its inundation, which made farming possible. God set his sights on this pivotal river, disabling its life-giving potential. And at the same time, this was a direct attack on either the god Hapi or Osiris, who were both connected to the river. Probably primary, though, was an attack on the Pharaoh himself, who was considered as a god and responsible for the well-being of his entire kingdom. He was powerless to stop the Lord. The second plague was sending forth frogs throughout all the land of Egypt. And he may have been targeting the goddess Hecate, who was supposed to bring life and prosperity and was depicted as a frog. But he was definitely attacking the Pharaoh. These gods were supposed to protect and care for their people, but they couldn't do anything. The third and fourth plague were gnats and mosquitoes. The first time, right here, this is the first time that the Pharaoh's magicians were unable to replicate the miracles. And the ensuing plagues were going to be more and more more than the magicians could handle, or their gods who gave the magicians powers could handle. They were forced to admit that their gods were unable to compete with the Lord. They confessed to the Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." On top of the magicians, God was likely targeting the god Khepri, a sun god, or the Pharaoh. Notice a pattern here? All of the plagues are going to target the Pharaoh because he was the immediate protector of Egypt and seen as one of the mightiest gods. Still, they were powerless against the God of the Bible. The fifth plague was the death of the Egyptians' livestock. And again, the Pharaoh was supposed to protect his people from harm and fight for them, but he was helpless. And yet, he kept refusing to submit to the one true God. He could have ended all of this and saved his people, but his pride wouldn't allow it. How was the mighty Pharaoh, Horus incarnate, going to submit to some lesser god? So the plagues kept coming. God then caused painful boils to appear on all the Egyptians, including the Pharaoh himself. He is still targeting the deified Pharaoh, but he's also likely attacking the god Sekhmet, which was the god of medicine and healing, and also the magicians who drew their power from the gods. None of them could cure these ailments. The seventh plague was hail in all the land of Egypt. And this plague would make the Pharaoh know that there is no one like God in all the earth. The Lord is attacking many sky gods here, from Min, Amun-Re, Tefnut, Nut, and Shu. These gods controlled the weather, but they were powerless to control even their own elements against God. The Pharaoh is also in view here. After the hail, God sent a massive cloud of locusts to afflict Egypt because Pharaoh kept refusing to humble himself before him. This is a direct attack on Pharaoh's kingship and godhood. Even his servants said that it would have been easier to submit to the Hebrew God because Egypt was being decimated, and none of the Egyptian gods could do anything about it. Another possible target may have been Sennacherib, who was the protector against pests. The ninth plague, darkness across the entire land, was a direct attack on the sun gods, Re, Amun-Re, Atum, as well as the Pharaoh, who was seen as Horus incarnate. And the final, most devastating plague of all was the death of the firstborn. This one is the most explicit in its attack on the Pharaoh, targeting his son. The Pharaoh, who was seen as a god, was not powerful enough to protect his own son, who was also a god, from the might of the Lord. And with God's final attack on the pantheon of Egypt, Pharaoh finally let the Hebrew slaves go. And this proved once and for all to the Israelites, the Egyptians, and to us as the readers that the Hebrew God is the God of the universe. Remember, these events are real. God is a God who interacts in history. The next example I want to mention is God versus Dagon from 1 Samuel 5 through 6. Now in 1 Samuel 4, the Israelites go to battle against the Philistines around Aphek, and they brought the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield. Now at first the Philistines were afraid because the Ark of the Lord was in the Hebrew camp. Remember what it did to Jericho? But they rallied themselves and went to battle against the Israelites. Surprisingly for the reader, the Philistines were victorious, and they took the ark as plunder. And then they brought the ark to the city of Ashdod and placed it in the temple of Dagon next to the deity. Remember, Dagon is the grain god. Here's where the story gets interesting, though. And I think it kind of hints to the reader that God may have planned to get captured all along. Now, I say God was captured because his presence dwelt on the ark, with the ark. He wasn't literally captured. The next morning, when the Philistines came into the temple, they found their god Dagon lying prostrate on his face before the ark of the Lord. Naturally, they were taken aback at this, but they picked him up, bolted him back down, placed him back in his spot in the temple. The next morning, when they got up and went and opened the temple, Dagon was again laying prostrate on the ground before the ark of God. But this time it was different. This time, the head of the statue of Dagon and both of his arms were cut off, and they were laying next to the body. Seeing this, the Philistines exclaimed, "The ark of the God of Israel must not dwell with us, for his hand is severe upon us and upon Dagon our God." And this kind of act against Dagon is called iconoclasm, the intentional destruction of cultic icons and objects. The Hebrew, though, interestingly, in this passage is very explicit that Dagon didn't just tip over or break on accident. God intentionally destroyed or even emasculated the god by cutting off his head and his arms. And this would have had a twofold effect on the Philistines. First, to see Dagon on the ground, essentially bowing down in submission to God, would have been demoralizing to the people. Then, to see Dagon's arms and head cut off would have left them mortified. The gods were part of every aspect of life in the ancient Near East. There was no separation between secular and religious. Those weren't even concepts or categories in their minds. Dagon was the protector who they relied upon along with the other gods. And it's one thing to defeat a people in battle. It's a completely different thing to defeat their gods. So after the defeat of Dagon, the Lord afflicted the people with various sicknesses to further solidify his dominance over them and their gods. And this defeat was so bad that the Philistines returned the ark to Israel. This is depicting them bringing it to Beit Shemesh. When they did this, the Philistines gave the Lord offerings and praised his name. And again, our Lord is proving to the Israelites, the Philistines, and to us as readers that he is a God and these idols are worthless pieces of material that can't do anything. They can't even save themselves. They can't even pick themselves off the ground when they fall over. Now I want to mention one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And this one is so clear in its affirmation that only our God is the true God and all other supposed gods are nothing. Followers of these gods worship them in vain. So the prophet Elijah versus the prophets of the storm god Baal. You can find this in 1 Kings 18. Now this is a picture of Mount Carmel where these events actually took place. And I reiterate this time and time again to wherever I preach at, because I want people to know the Bible records real places, or real people in real places doing real things. So in the midst of the reign of the evil Israelite king Ahab, he was confronted, rebuked by Elijah, the prophet of the Lord, about his rampant idolatry, abandoning the God of Israel for the false god Baal. And then he told the king to send all Israel, as well as 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the goddess Asherah, to Mount Carmel. Right over here. Now at the mountain, Elijah told the Israelites to bring 2 bowls, one for him and one for the other prophets. Each bowl was to be cut up and then placed on an altar to see whose deity could burn it up with fire. Whichever deity was able to burn it up was the true God. Now the prophets of Baal went first. They called upon the name of their God from morning to noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But no voice came. They then performed a cultic ceremony that featured kind of a hobbling dance to elicit a response. Seeing this, Elijah mocked them mercilessly, saying, "Call with a great voice, for he is a god. Either he is meditating or he's busy, or he has gone on a journey, or perhaps he's sleeping and needs to be awakened. Sound familiar? Remember how these idols needed to be awakened, fed, clothed, entertained, etc. Sometimes the gods would even forget to attend to their duties. And Elijah was drawing upon this knowledge when he mocked Baal, demonstrating that he was powerless. He was not even a god. So the prophets then called out with a great voice, and they cut themselves according to their custom until the blood poured from their arms. And this appears to have been some sort of custom that can be found in a few places in the ancient Near East, maybe with the Hittites, maybe at Ugarit. Even with all of this, though, there was still no answer from Baal. When it was Elijah's turn, however, things were different. He repaired the altar of the Lord, placed the bowl upon it, and covered the entire thing in water 3 times. He then called out to God, saying, and I'll quote his words here, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and I have done all these things according to your words. Answer me, O Lord, answer me. Then this people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." At that instant, God rained down fire and completely consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and the water. The people then fell prostrate and cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Elijah then took the prophets and took them to the Kishon brook over here and killed them. Now I want to mention that where Elijah is standing on Mount Carmel, he has a direct view of Mount Ebal to the southeast. And this is important because while he was demonstrating God's supremacy over Baal and the other gods by association, he was also likely thinking about Joshua's covenant renewal in Joshua 24, which took place at Mount Ebal. Joshua said in chapter 24, "If it is evil," talking to the Israelites, "if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today who you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served across the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are dwelling. But I and my house, we will serve the Lord." I think it's possible that Elijah orchestrated this whole challenge to Israel and the prophets based on what Joshua said here. Final example from the Old Testament that I want to use. And keep in mind, there are literally thousands of other examples. Is Ezekiel chapter 8, where God's presence abandons the temple, the place that He dwelt for hundreds of years, basically Israel's entire history in the land, because Judah was so far gone in their idolatry. And this passage alone should make us take a step back and examine ourselves. And it's actually a pretty sad story, I think. One day, as the prophet Ezekiel was sitting at his house with the elders of Judah, God showed him in a vision of the abominations that were being committed in his temple by the people. And in the vision, Ezekiel says that he entered the court of the temple and saw every form of creeping thing and beast, detestable thing, and all the idols of the house of Israel engraved upon the walls. Looking further in, Ezekiel saw that 70 elders were standing around these foreign cultic images with incense and in the dark. And at the same time, they were saying to themselves over and over again, "Yahweh does not see us. Yahweh has forsaken this land." This means that within the inner rooms of the holy temple of the Lord, 70 prominent leaders were profaning the holiness of the structure by their worshiping of other gods in the darkness, probably a cultic ritual observance. So you could imagine this in your minds. When I imagine it, it seems like a scary thing. They're in the dark chanting like that. Moreover, they believed that God had abandoned them, furthers these abominable practices. They were worshiping and serving these gods rather than the Lord in order to save them from impending danger. And after seeing this horrendous scene, God told Ezekiel that he would show him even worse abominations within the temple. He was brought down to the entrance of the gate of the temple, and women were sitting down weeping for the Mesopotamian god Tammuz. Now, a particularly noteworthy story of why they're weeping for Tammuz comes from the story called Inanna's descent. Inanna is Ishtar. In the myth, Ishtar became trapped in the netherworld after trying to usurp the throne. And in order to escape, she needed to provide a substitute. In a fit of rage after seeing that her husband Tammuz was not mourning for her, she substituted him for her. He was trapped there for half a year during the dry season. And the weeping for Tammuz in Ezekiel 8 shows that the Judahites were observing this annual mourning ritual for this god. They had abandoned the Lord for Tammuz. And the abominations were being committed by 70 elders. The abominations being committed by the 70 elders that we just talked about. God considered this even worse. Then the Lord showed Ezekiel still greater corruptions in his temple. This is the final thing that Ezekiel was shown. And he was brought to the inner court of the temple. And at the entrance, between the porch and the altar, were 25 men, with their backs to the temple and their faces toward the east, and they were bowing down toward the sun. As we've talked about many times, the sun, regardless of what nation it is, was always one of the prime, most powerful deities. And it's possible that they were bowing to Egyptian sun gods like Re or even the Ugaritic god Shapshu. But I think, given the reference to Tammuz in verse 14, it seems likely that the god in view here is Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun god. Repeatedly throughout the Hebrew Bible, God was clear that he was the only God, and these celestial bodies were nothing more than just created objects subject to his will. But despite the Judahites knowing this, they still bowed down to these bodies and worshiped them. The ordering of the abominations in itself is very interesting. The first great abomination was the 70 elders worshiping stone carvings in the inner room of the temple. The second and even greater abomination was the women mourning for Tammuz in the inner courtyard of the temple. And the final and greatest abomination was the bowing down of the sun god at the porch of the temple. And the most natural thought is that the order should be oriented inward. Toward the inner parts of the temple where God dwelt and where his most holy place was. Porch, courtyard, and then inner temple. But that's not what happens. That's not what we see. It actually starts in the middle and goes outward, inner rooms, all the way to the courtyard and then to the porch. It goes from in to out. And this may not refer to the worship of the sun god being more egregious than the worship of Tammuz or the other gods. Rather, I think it appears that the vision is moving from inside the temple to the outside, symbolizing God's imminent departure from the temple. And each abomination committed moved God further and further away from the people of Judah, concluding with the last straw, the worship of the sun god. And this caused God to abandon his temple completely. And it's especially noteworthy that in Ezekiel 10, 2 chapters later, God's presence exits the temple through the east gate, in the very direction that the people looked out and worshiped the sun from. So, I don't think this is accurate, supposed to be accurate, but if this is the Mount of Olives, east would be this way. It is also remarkable that Jesus, who is God incarnate, entered Jerusalem for his triumphal entry to die for our sins. He enters from the east via the very same gate or the same part of the wall that God left from in Ezekiel. So what does this event tell us? God takes the worship of these false gods, idolatry, very seriously. We never want to let ourselves become so far gone that there is virtually no return. Fortunately, though, there's always forgiveness and redemption, as can be seen in the example of Jesus' return to Jerusalem. And then just a quick, to end this series of examples, just a quick note from the New Testament. This one comes from Paul in Acts 19. While Paul was staying in Western Asia Minor, the Turkey area, his preaching about the one true God caused a huge disturbance for the local silversmiths. And they specialized in making silver shrines for the goddess of the hunt, Artemis, for the Romans, Diana. These were not just small statues of the goddess, but they were rather depictions of her sitting on her throne in the center of the temple. And these shrines were probably sold to people and used as dedicatory offerings. And they would have been brought to the temple and then offered to the goddess. This is how these silversmiths made their living. However, Paul's preaching that gods made by hands are no gods at all persuaded many people to turn away from idolatry. Acts records that it records the conversation of the silversmiths. They said, "Not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all Asia and the world worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence." This filled the silversmiths with rage, and they rallied the people of the city, causing Paul and his companions to flee for fear of being killed. But what this account shows us is that the message of the true gospel is so potent that it actually has the power to change lives, even the lives of people who had worshipped false idols for their entire lives. And it also shows us, which I think we've all experienced, that there is an evil one who will do whatever he can to stop the spread of the gospel. Spiritual warfare is just as real now as it was then and as it was in the time of the Old Testament. Now I want to do some introspection as we wind down. I want us to think about the things today that we have the tendency to turn into idols. Are they really any different than the types of things we just went over? Sure, we don't call them gods, but we do the same things with them. And we have the tendency to elevate these things over God. And I say we because I'm guilty of the same thing. It's an ongoing struggle, which is why we always need to examine ourselves. Let's look at our phones, for example. How often do we sit and scroll on our phones for hours and hours each day looking at nothing, when we could be using that time for praying or in the Bible or anything else? Before my wife Kaylin and I quit social media years ago, we would literally scroll on our phones all day. And there's even a special term for this now called doom scrolling. Sports is another strong example of idolatry. Here in America, we literally worship our athletes. In fact, a movie just came out called Him, which is about this exact subject and even has a lot of biblical allusions and symbolism. I've attended churches where they switched things around to cater to the Super Bowl or other sporting events. Money, though, is probably the thing that we all struggle with the most. Now, money isn't inherently bad. You need it to function in society. But the coveting of money is what makes it an idol. Jesus himself even addresses this in Matthew 6, saying, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." And there are hundreds of examples, and I'm sure each one of us can think of a huge range of things. But whatever it is, the heart of the matter is that we are putting things over God, the God of the universe, who wants nothing more than to have a relationship with each one of us, and who gave us his word so that we could know him personally. Now, with this very important but heavy topic on idols versus the true God, I want to give a description of the true God. Who is it that we worship? And this will be the last thing that I say. We believe in, worship, and have a relationship with one singular being who is uncreated, all good, all powerful, all knowing. And this being we call God. And there's only one God. And the Bible, from beginning to end, is clear on that. We're monotheists. The biblical text testifies that this one God exists in what we call three persons, who are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But don't think of person like you and I are people. This is just a theological term that we use that describes the members of the Trinity. A very common phrase that people use is three who's and one what. Now, each of these persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, are eternal and equal in every way. However, the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit is not the Father. They are distinct, but all exist as the one being of God. The Son, the second person of the Trinity, existed as what we call the pre-incarnate Son in eternity past and throughout the Old Testament. He's the one who ate with Abraham and spoke to him about Sodom and Gomorrah, for example. And at a certain point in history, he took on a human nature and added it to his divine nature when he was born of a virgin, as Isaiah prophesied, making himself fully God and fully human. And this is where we get the concept of Son of God from. Jesus is not the literal Son of God, like we have children today. Instead, Son of God has to do with the roles that each of the persons play in the redemption of the world. The Son has the role of entering into flesh and being subject to the Father. The Spirit's role is to indwell believers. And this entering into flesh allowed Jesus to fulfill all the requirements of the Messiah, such as being from the line of David, being born of a virgin, calling the people back to God in repentance, dying for our sins, physically resurrecting on the third day, and bodily sitting at the right hand of God, the Father, etc., and many more things. Plus, I think Isaiah is clear, for example, there's many other examples, that it is only God who can truly take away sins and bring about redemption and salvation. So Jesus must be fully God and fully human, and not a mere physical illusion like the Docetists claimed, who John the Apostle is reacting against. Our God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and truth. He acts in history. He's just, rightfully punishing the wicked, and he's merciful, offering forgiveness when we don't deserve it. He is the true and living God of the universe, who has toppled mighty empires and risen up insignificant peoples. He goes toe-to-toe with the most powerful gods of the nations and comes out victorious, proving that they're not even gods at all. He needs nothing but wants a relationship with each one of us and has provided through Jesus the Messiah a way for salvation and the opportunity to live with him forever. Now, I want to end tonight by quoting a couple verses from Psalm 115 and Habakkuk 2. Psalm 115, "Why should the nations say, 'Where is their God?' Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he desires. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. They have noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. They do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them are like them. So are all who trust in them." And then a couple verses from Habakkuk 2. "What profit is a divine image when its maker has formed it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation, making speechless idols. Woe to him who says to the wood, 'Wake up,' to the silent stone, 'Awake.' Can it teach? Look, it is overlaid with gold and silver. There is no breath within it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Be silent before him, all the earth." This is the God that we worship. Thank you for being here tonight.